You walk into a supermarket on a Saturday afternoon and it's packed. Every register has a line. Carts are overflowing. The parking lot is full. It looks, by any normal measure, like a business printing money. That's the assumption almost everyone carries around without ever testing it. High traffic plus high revenue must equal high profit.
It doesn't. A typical supermarket chain in the United States runs on a net profit margin of around 1 to 3%. That means for every $100 that crosses the register, the company that owns the store keeps somewhere between $1 and $3 after all the bills are paid. Compare that to a software company running margins of 20 or 30%, or even a coffee chain running 10 to 15%, and the picture starts to look strange. The busiest, most essential retail format in the country, the one people cannot avoid using, is also one of the least profitable businesses you could choose to own.
So the real question isn't how much money does a supermarket make, it's why does anyone own one at all, and where does the actual money comes from? Because it isn't coming from where you think.
Start with why the margin is so thin in the first place. A can of soup costs roughly the same whether you buy it at one chain or the one across the street. Shoppers know this. They compare prices, they clip coupons, they drive to whichever store has the better deal that week, and they'll switch loyalty over a difference of a few cents on milk or eggs. That price transparency strips out almost any room to charge more than a competitor. Add to that the fact that groceries are largely commoditized. A box of the same cereal is functionally identical no matter who sells it, and you get an industry where the product itself gives the seller almost no pricing power. Raise prices too aggressively, and customers leave immediately, because switching costs are close to zero. A grocer competing on price isn't a choice, it's survival.
That's the part most people can guess if they think about it for a minute. What they don't expect is what happens next. The store keeps operating, keeps expanding, keeps getting bought and sold for billions of dollars, even though the grocery itself is barely breaking even. That only makes sense once you realize the supermarket isn't really one business. It's several businesses layered on top of each other, and only one of them is actually called groceries. The first layer is something closer to banking than retail. It's called the cash conversion cycle, and in most industries, it works against the seller. You buy inventory, you sit on it, and only later does it sell and turn into cash. Supermarkets flip that entirely. Because groceries move so fast off the shelf, a store often sells a product and collects the customer's cash within days, sometimes hours. But the store doesn't have to pay its supplier for that same product for 30, 60, sometimes 90 days. For that window, the retailer is sitting on cash that technically belongs to someone else. Multiply that across an entire chain, moving billions of dollars in inventory annually, and you get a company that is, in effect, running an interest-free loan from its suppliers at all times. Large chains invest that float, use it to fund expansion, or simply hold it as working capital. It doesn't show up as grocery profit on paper, but it's real money, generated by the pure mechanics of how fast things sell versus how slowly the store has to pay for them.
Here's where an obvious question comes up. If the store is essentially borrowing from suppliers for free, why would any supplier agree to that? The answer is the second hidden mechanism, and it flips the entire relationship most people assume exists between a grocery chain and the brands on its shelves. Most shoppers assume the customer of a supermarket is the person pushing the cart. In one very real sense, it isn't. A significant slice of a large chain's revenue comes not from shoppers, but from the suppliers themselves through what the industry calls slotting fees. A consumer packaged goods company that wants a new product placed at eye level, or wants an end cap display near the entrance, or wants guaranteed shelf space in the cereal aisle, often pays the retailer directly for that placement, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars per item per region, before a single unit has sold to an actual customer. This is money the store collects regardless of whether the product succeeds. It's a separate revenue stream sitting quietly underneath the visible transaction at the register, and it's one of the reasons shelf placement in a grocery store is never random. That center aisle at exactly eye level isn't there because it's convenient for you. It's there because someone paid for it to be. Once you see that, the incentive structure of the entire store starts to look different. The products competing hardest for your attention aren't necessarily the ones customers want most. They're the ones whose manufacturers were willing to pay the most for visibility. The shopper thinks they're browsing. In part, they're walking through a paid advertisement built into physical shelving.
But slotting fees and floats still aren't the biggest piece. The biggest piece is the one sitting quietly on a shelf with the store's own name on it, private label.
When a chain manufactures or contracts out its own store brand version of pasta, paper towels, or frozen vegetables, it can typically sell that product at 15 to 30% less than the national brand equivalent and still earn a higher margin than it does on the name brand version sitting right next to it. That sounds contradictory until you understand why. The retailer cuts out the manufacturer's marketing budget, the manufacturer's own profit margin, and the slotting fees they'd otherwise have to negotiate around. They control the entire chain from production to shelf. A product that looks like a bargain for the customer is often the single most profitable item in that aisle for the store. This is why private label sections have expanded so aggressively across nearly every major chain over the past 2 decades. Not to be generous to budget-conscious shoppers, though that's the visible effect, but because it's quietly one of the strongest profit engines available to a grocery retailer.
So already the picture has shifted twice. First, from the shopper is obviously the customer, to suppliers are paying customers too. Now from national brands are the moneymakers, to the store's own products, priced to look cheap, are often the most lucrative thing on the shelf.
There's a third layer, and it's the one that explains why supermarket real estate deals get so much attention from investors who have never touched a grocery cart. Pharmacies inside supermarkets typically carry gross margins several times higher than the grocery side of the business. Fuel stations attached to supermarket parking lots run on volume and loyalty card discounting that pulls customers in for gas and keeps them walking back inside. Loyalty programs, the ones asking for your phone number or a scannable card at checkout, aren't primarily about giving you a discount. They're a data collection operation. That purchase history gets analyzed, packaged, and in many cases sold or licensed to the very consumer brands paying for shelf placement, so those companies can target their advertising more precisely. And underneath all of it sits the physical real estate itself. Many supermarket chains own or hold long-term leases on some of the most valuable, high-traffic parcels of land in a given metro area, land whose appreciating value can dwarf the annual profit generated by the store operating on top of it. Put all of that together and you arrive at the counterintuitive core of the whole industry. The groceries themselves, the part that gives the business its name, the part that fills 90% of the physical space and generates the overwhelming majority of the revenue, are frequently the least profitable part of the entire operation. They function as a loss leader for everything else happening under that roof. The store needs you walking those aisles, filling that cart, scanning that loyalty card, because that foot traffic is what makes the pharmacy, the private label margin, the fuel station, the supplier fees, and the data all possible. You're not just buying milk, you're the mechanism that makes 6 other businesses profitable. That explains why the industry survives on wafer-thin margins. It doesn't yet explain what happens when something goes wrong. And something usually does, because a business this dependent on volume is extremely fragile the moment volume drops or costs rise even slightly.
Here's the chain reaction, and it's worth walking through slowly because each step makes the next one almost inevitable. A margin of 1 to 3% means there is almost no buffer. If labor costs rise, or a competitor undercuts prices in the same market, or fuel and distribution costs climb, the store can't simply absorb it. The shortfall goes straight to the bottom line. So the pressure gets pushed outward, onto the parts of the business considered easiest to control: staffing levels, hours, and headcount on the floor. Chains have leaned hard into automation and self-checkout for exactly this reason. Fewer cashiers per shift lowers the single largest controllable cost in the store. But self-checkout creates a second-order problem nobody advertises: shrinkage, the industry term for inventory loss to theft, scanning errors, and unrecorded loss, climbs measurably in self-checkout environments compared to staffed lanes because there are fewer eyes on the transaction, and the barrier to walking out with an unscanned item drops significantly. Retail shrinkage nationally sits in the range of 1.5% of sales in a typical year, which sounds small until you remember the entire net profit margin of the business is only 1 to 3%. Shrinkage alone can consume half or more of total profit.
So stores respond to rising shrinkage with more loss prevention, locked cases for common theft items, additional security staff, receipt checks at the door, purchase limits. Each of those measures adds friction to the shopping experience. And friction is exactly what a business with zero pricing power and zero customer loyalty margin can least afford. Because the customer standing in that longer line, waiting for an employee to unlock a case of razors or laundry detergent, has another grocery store within a few miles that doesn't make them do that. They leave. Volume drops. And volume, remember, is the entire foundation the business was built on. The float depends on it, the slotting fee leverage depends on it, the private label profit depends on it. Pull volume out from under a business running 1 to 3% margins, and it doesn't shrink gracefully. It becomes unprofitable almost immediately.
That exact spiral has played out in American retail history in one of the clearest case studies available, the rise and collapse of the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, better known as A&P. A&P wasn't just a grocery chain. For most of the 20th century, it was the largest retailer in the entire United States, full stop. Bigger than any department store, any catalog company, any competitor in any category. At its peak in the 1930s, A&P operated more than 15,000 stores across the country and was, by some measures, the largest retailer on earth. The company is widely credited with helping invent the modern supermarket format itself. Self-service aisles, standardized pricing, centralized purchasing power that let it negotiate lower supplier costs than any independent grocer could match, and an early aggressive embrace of private label products under its own brand names. The same private label margin advantage described earlier, decades before it became standard industry practice.
That scale gave A&P enormous purchasing leverage, which let it undercut smaller grocers on price consistently. It grew large enough that in the 1940s, the federal government pursued antitrust action against the company, arguing its buying power had become anti-competitive. A strange kind of validation. Nobody sues a company for being anti-competitive unless it has become extraordinarily dominant.
But the same volume-dependent, razor-thin margin model that built A&P's empire eventually became the mechanism of its decline. Newer competitors, chains built from the ground up around suburban expansion, larger store formats, and increasingly sophisticated private label and supply chain strategies of their own, matched and then exceeded A&P's efficiency. A&P was slow to modernize its store formats and slow to relocate into the growing suburbs where its customer base was moving. Its market share eroded gradually through the 1960s and 1970s, and each percentage point of lost volume cut directly into a margin structure that had almost no room to absorb the loss. A business that once used scale as a weapon against competitors found the same logic turned against it.
The company limped through decades of decline, sold off assets, changed ownership, restructured repeatedly, and eventually filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in December 2010, emerged from it, and then filed for bankruptcy again in July 2015, this time unable to find a buyer willing to keep the company intact. A&P liquidated later that year, closing its remaining stores and selling them off individually to competitors. A company that had once been the single largest retailer on the planet ceased to exist entirely within roughly a century of its founding, undone not by a single cataclysmic failure, but by the slow compounding effect of thin margins meeting eroding volume year after year until there was nothing left to absorb the damage.
What A&P proves is exactly the mechanism described earlier, played out over decades instead of a single bad quarter. A business this dependent on volume doesn't fail suddenly. It fails gradually, and then all at once, because the margin structure that made it dominant during growth becomes the exact same structure that makes it fragile during decline.
The rest of the industry learned from that, even if indirectly. Modern grocery chains have leaned even harder into the layers that sit outside pure grocery sales. Pharmacy counters have expanded. Fuel loyalty partnerships have become standard. Private label lines now often occupy entire aisles rather than a handful of shelf tags. And loyalty program data has become valuable enough that some chains now describe themselves internally as media and advertising companies that happen to also sell groceries.
Consolidation has accelerated too. Chains merge specifically to gain the purchasing scale that made A&P dominant in the first place. Because in a business this margin-starved, scale isn't a nice advantage, it's close to the only advantage that matters. And e-commerce grocery delivery, despite enormous investment across the industry, still runs on margins so thin, sometimes negative once delivery and fulfillment labor costs are counted, that most chains treat it as a customer retention tool rather than a standalone profit source. Another loss leader stacked on top of the original one.
So what does owning a supermarket actually look like across the range of outcomes? In the best case, an operator with real scale, enough stores to negotiate serious supplier leverage, a strong private label program, a pharmacy and loyalty data operation running underneath the grocery floor, and real estate that appreciates over time can build a durable, profitable enterprise, even if the grocery line item alone barely breaks even. That's the model behind most of the largest, most stable chains operating today.
In the realistic middle case, a regional chain survives for decades on tight disciplined margins, competitive pricing, and just enough of those secondary revenue layers to stay solvent without ever becoming spectacularly profitable. A business that works, but only if run carefully, indefinitely, with almost no room for strategic error. And in the failure case, the one A&P eventually landed in, a chain loses volume gradually, has no real estate or private label cushion large enough to offset it, and finds that a business built on 1 to 3% margins simply cannot survive an extended decline. There is no fourth option where a standalone grocery operation selling only groceries at competitive prices becomes wildly profitable on its own. That version of the business does not exist at scale, and arguably never has.
Which brings the whole picture back to where it started, standing in that crowded parking lot on a Saturday afternoon. The store looks busy because it needs to be busy. That traffic is the entire engine, not a byproduct of success. Every full cart moving through checkout isn't primarily generating grocery profit. It's generating the foot traffic, the data, the float, and the volume that make the pharmacy, the private label margin, the supplier fees, and the real estate actually work. The groceries were never really the business. They were the price of admission to everything else happening quietly underneath them.